And great. So yeah, everybody, thank you. Welcome to, I think it's our third to last. I guess this is the middle talk of our series. And so today we're talking about the effective altruism movement in particular. So the last couple sessions we've talked about altruism as a concept, and then looked at some specific stuff like the radical kidney donor cases. And so today we're looking at a social movement, so to speak, that prides itself or aims to try and realize certain particularly altruistic outcomes. And so if you got a chance to listen to the podcast, you'll see that there were some folks on who gave like essentially pro effective altruism and as well as critiques of the position. And so we'll start there. But I do want to notice that there's a few new folks here, and so welcome. Thanks for coming. Um, yeah, does as usual, I don't usually do a lot of setup. I am gonna put out there that I have a bias towards effective altruism, and so as best as possible, I'm gonna undermine that bias here. But you should know that that's a position I hold so that you can interpret me with that lens. With that, I'm just gonna ask if anyone, well, actually, did folks have a chance to listen to the podcast? Did some of y'all get a chance? Awesome. Would anyone like to start by sharing some of their thoughts? So I have some various things we can discuss. We could go through. There's essentially 4 lines of argument that are offered here, represented by those 4 different figures. But is there anything that stuck out to folks from the podcast? Those who got to watch it, so to speak, not watch, listen.
Hey, Josh, can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so one thing that I think really stuck out to me was this distinction that was sometimes made and then sometimes blurred between effective altruism or altruism in general and mutual aid. This idea of doing good um, in a mutual way such that there's the potential for good to come back to you. And I think that both of those are probably overall goods, but very distinct things. Like mutual aid is something distinct from altruism.
Yeah, that's something we might. All right. Yeah, I see Jason. I see you nodding your head. Did you want
Yeah,
to
I was
jump in
gonna
as well?
say this last few weeks we've been talking about pure altruism. Can you do anything without self-interest? Feels like mutual aid is like abandoning the thought of excluding your self-interest, right? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours when we need. Um, Made a lot of sense. And yeah, I guess for me, listening to the podcast, I just felt just more and more certain that we do not want a world of pure altruism, actually. And that for those that haven't joined, we've been talking for a few weeks about people that donate kidneys or people that randomly save people in danger. What compels us? Is it even possible in our, or are we biologically compelled to be altruistic? And can we actually sacrifice ourselves for the benefit of another without self-benefit? And I kind of still believe the answer is no. Even in these effective altruism, and I found myself being frustrated with the ways the definition of altruism was being redefined or for convenience by the 4 different argumenters. Um, for example, so yeah, I just want to acknowledge Ian's point that the mutual aid and altruism stuff, um, very distinct paradigms. I could not argue one is better than the other because I believe all humans, we have different value systems, and um, I think that's really the core of the philosophical kind of the thought here, like how our free will gives us that freedom to choose what is valuable. And you can always make an argument that there is no universally more valuable thing. In fact, it is sort of fascinating. And I think it's because there's no utilitarian. I guess I used to think highly of utilitarianism, but now I more and more think less of it as being optimal is not necessarily the best, right? And that's really what this episode and effective altruism really felt like being most optimal. And I just was really unconvinced that being most optimal makes it more just or right than anything else because value is subjective. They talked about so many things like existential threats and like long-term problems. We have short-term problems. People are struggling to live today. So there's a lot of I opened up a can of worms perhaps to discuss, but I guess I left, well, like Curtis, the person, the donor.
Right.
I didn't know about Give Directly as a nonprofit. And that felt really compelling to me too. The thought that helping with autonomy is more important because those people have different values than you may have. I think we mentioned this before that the best thing you can do is find out what someone actually needs and give that to them rather perhaps than tell them what they need.
Yeah. Well, thanks. There is several cans of worms there. So, I don't know. Does anyone have one of the things that maybe Jason said that they want to jump in on? I'm taking like little notes for things we could come back to, but as best as possible. I'm really bad at surrendering the moderation chair, and so I really would like to go wherever the discussion leads.
Joshua, I think it would help me if we could have opinions about charity and what's worth, but I really like the philosophical part of it as well. Like what are those deeper questions that need to be answered, not
Right.
so much like the practical. I'm also interested in the
Yeah.
theoretical part. So appreciate your help parsing that
Yeah.
part of the discussion.
I mean, just because folks may not have all listened, I feel like or maybe we don't remember all the elements. There was like the podcast, right, had this guy Curtis come on, and he was going to give some amount of money, and then there's four essentially different people come on and give their case for what Curtis should do with the money. And the first is this EA, or effective altruism 1.0, which is really measurable metrics focused. I think in the end the recommendation was some of these give well charities, and so the idea is here like I'm just as important as somebody halfway across the world, and so if I can help people, on the other side of the earth better than I can help people in my own community or something, then given that we're equal or something, we ought to help them. And the further idea here is that we do have some obligations to help those in need. Then I think the second person was this Perlman, and she argues, right, that, well, there's more to the story than just trying to maximize our outcomes or get the optimal outcome. And she thinks you ought to be thinking about things like what caring is. And so there's like this, I think the word they use is a pluralist about these sorts of values of charity. So one value is like, yeah, we want to have efficient or effective outcomes. We want to realize, some optimal state of affairs, right? But she also thinks there's something in that process of giving that's important, right? Or something like maybe a relationship of solidarity with somebody, or Ian's bringing up that mutual aid language, right? So there's something good there that might be relevant too, and you can't just say, okay, helping the most people is the only thing we should care about when we think about charity. We should also think about, okay, what relationship am I standing in with these people? Are there certain values related to charity, maybe more than mutual aid, that are relevant here? That's the sort of position she has. I think she ends up saying you should give some money to local communities, to folks you do feel a connection to. Then I forget the guy's name or the person's name, but then there's someone with a British accent who represents effective autism 2.0, right? And there's a shift, and this is a real shift that happened in much of the effective autism movement towards a sort of long-termism, is what they call it, or what we call it. And the idea is that, like, well, future people matter too, or future sources of value, whatever, humans, non-humans, whatever, those individuals matter. And so if you think future generations matter, and then you also think that maybe you can do something now that makes the world much better in 1,000 or 10,000 years or something, then that can be relevant. And the key thing there, which is also drawn out by the last guy, is this idea that, like, for folks of this effective autism 2.0, there's a huge difference between 99% of human beings dying and all of human beings dying, because the sorts of cultural value, the sort of interest that human beings have, our capacities for whatever, all the things we care about. Well, not all. Many of the things we care about would seem to disappear when there's no humanity, is the idea. And so they end up having a lot of focus on things like existential risk. So that's risk to the extinction of the human species. Things like pandemics, but also a big hot topic issue here is artificial intelligence safety. So not like how is artificial intelligence going to like destroy the job market? That's actually very near term for them. They're thinking like, what about if we have an artificial intelligence that like has interests or values different than human beings, and so decides to wipe us out, decides to do something horrible to us or whatever. And then the last guy, Seth Lazar, who happens to work on artificial intelligence stuff, he has this idea that no, what you should be thinking about when you think about how to give is how can you promote autonomy. And so that's like I would say the positive story there. He also has this sort of critical story of effective altruism, at least 2.0. They think, one, it moves away from the focus on measurable impact and instead is thinking about chances of success in a way that Lazar worries about. And two, he makes a suggestion, which we can talk about how fair it is, that he thinks that the folks who advocate for this movement, right, what they like about the far future is there's nobody who can say, no, that's not actually what I want. And so they're people who have a lot of power who don't want to give that power up. People who look like me, for example, right? And there's a lot of demographic truth to that description of the EA 2.0 folks too. So there's some weight there. And so I think those are maybe the broad scopes. And so there's different things that different folks are centering. So maybe as a chance to reiterate again, and then I'll turn it over a little more. EA1s focus a lot on metrics and trying to find an optimal output. And there's also this connection to like changes we can see and understand like in the here and now. So they have a lot of focus on malaria prevention or giving really low cost vitamin supplements to folks in very poor situations or in absolute poverty. Perlman suggests there's more to giving than just maximizing certain outcomes. And so she thinks we have to think about other morally important things. So she objects to the flattening of moral value that's part of EA1 and certainly EA2. EA2 kind of steps away from present, so in this world, harms and benefits, and starts thinking about the far future, because I think people in the far future might matter too, or animals or whoever, things like that matter. And in particular, they think there's a huge difference between absolute extinction of a species, particularly human beings, versus some amount of those individuals, like 99% of us all dying, because at least the culture and the civilization can go on. And then Lazar thinks there's a lot of silliness in both the EA moves about focusing on realizing certain outcomes, and instead he thinks we should just focus on trying to promote autonomy. Anyone want to add or edit my summary? Because again, I could have a bias here. Yeah, thank you, Jason. Right, so this is the thing that I put out in the calls. Like these are the sorts of questions we might talk about. I think an additional one that just it strikes me from Jason's earlier thing is one, this idea of should we be aiming at certain outcomes, and is autonomy like one of those outcomes, or is autonomy the outcome we should aim at versus what we think is good or what we happen to think is good? This gets into questions right of subjective or subjective value, right? So if I think what's good is good for everybody, then it might be easier for me to justify doing what I think is best for Jason, or what I know is best for Jason from my perspective. Whereas if we think people have different preferences and those can be just as good, we might have a leaning towards autonomy. And then I think the question that Ian brought up earlier about the distinction between maybe altruism, especially as we've been discussing in the last few sessions, and something like mutual aid or solidarity, which is necessarily more reciprocal. But yeah, with that, I think feel free to jump in on anything. In particular, if any of the new voices want to jump in. So Marsha or I did it better. Srijita?
Srijita, you got it the first time.
Okay, perfect. You should know there's no like for folks who are new, there's no like you have to have a right answer. We're really discussing and playing around. This isn't like you're gonna leave with the facts or anything.
I can jump us off. So comparing 1.0, effective altruism 1.0 versus the longer term 2.0 idea, the modeler and me had some interesting connections to like probability distributions. And maybe if you're looking at something like effective altruism 1.0, that version, where it's something in the moment now, helping people right now, you can, it is kind of one-to-one. Like you can pretty much, if you're donating to the right cause, you can track that dollar. You can see the immediate impacts. And the folks on the 2.0 side are saying, yes, but obviously, like for the future of forever, there's going to be way more people, therefore way more potential for suffering. So that's automatically going to be bigger. But maybe the issue here is more the uncertainty around how your help now will help then. So, and I think they vaguely touched on that with things like AI and things like epidemics, because we basically anything we do now could actually be failures in those regards, and therefore there would have been no reduction of suffering. So even though the potential is higher, there is actually a potential for zero probability, like zero success as well. And that was really interesting to me. And I think one of the suggestions that one of the speakers, I think it was the second person who gave Curtis actually recommendations on how he should spend his money, he actually went ahead and said, well, we're just going to temper it. We're going to say you 60% here, 30% here, 5 and 5 here. And I thought that was at least interesting, because in my mind, I was thinking about the kind of probability distributions, like I said, of potential success, and how those are different between the two EA models there. I hope
Yeah,
that
and also like this idea of like, one, how do we assess probability, or how do we use that sort of that approach in making decisions is a kind of big thing in EA 2.0 particular. So there's a Will McCaskill, he's a moral philosopher who's really important in this movement. One of his questions that he explores in his research is trying to figure out how we should deal with moral uncertainty, right? And so given that, yeah, we might have a belief about the world. So he believes there's right and wrong. He believes there's objective values, as far as I understand, but he thinks we're liable to make mistakes about that. And so we should take that liability, that possibility of making a mistake seriously in choosing what we do. And so that's why, I forget the name of the recommender, why they recommend, splitting things up, 60% for far future, 30% present absolute poverty stuff, and then 5 for animals and 5 for local community.
Yeah, I want to touch on that distribution concept. That I think in my life with friends, we've had arguments about whether you donate to a cause. Do you care just about what happens in the United States? Do we even care about what happens outside the US? Help your countrymen, right? Like, we have so many problems here. Why would you do X, Y, Z? I remember, I think it was like Coney, for example, in Africa, that was like a big moment, an argument with friends about whether to combat that. And I left that discussion realizing there are enough people in the world, in my opinion, to handle all problems we have. We don't all have to be 100% in agreement on what problem to solve. There are sufficient problems and enough human resources to address them, right? So I think this concept of like, what is our obligation to give, and to give to what, focuses too much on us as an individual, and rather than us as a society of people. It's, I think, so long as problems are sufficiently addressed by a subset of a population, or motivated individuals, that I would imagine like we're going to be better off for that, rather than excluding all problems for the sake of just a subset. And so often, right, just conversations about how to spend funds in government on XYZ projects, right? And perhaps I think realizing that we can distribute this and tackle many problems effectively should be like an allowed thought for us to have. And it's so I think realizing your individual obligation, like, I'm not sure is as important as the societal obligation and the coordination between people about problems. At least EA and like GiveWell and those sites are nice because they are explaining these are, I think there's another one, 80,000 hours that I learned that I think references something similar. And they're like, these are underfunded areas that we do need to put more resources in. Please consider donating your time to have an immense impact. But they acknowledge those, those are underfunded, but there are still plenty of other good ways to donate. And so, yeah, I think this effort of awareness and campaigning for causes is really important. But I still remain unconvinced that like any one person actually has an obligation to be altruistic, actually, and that we need to be selfish is like this like fascinating idea to me, to not sacrifice ourselves completely for randomly, like let's say. Like maybe a thought experiment would be, what if we randomly donated to causes as people rather than ones that we cared about, right? Completely removed any human decision making in that regard. Would our world be better off or not? Or how important is it that it is actually directed, right? So that's just one thought to have about the fairness of it, and being purely altruistic in that randomness, right? Like you don't even have a chance to feel reward or motivated to give if it's completely random and anonymous, maybe. Or how important is it for us humans to feel like we are impacting things we care about, or those things that Joshua mentioned too, like the solidarity with one another and mutual aid as well. And I argue we're social creatures, so it's like we really have this like need to have an affinity for others, to feel communal. So yeah, curious what y'all think about obligations and that thought about, yeah, the pure altruistic behavior and distribution of our efforts.
I'm always ready to jump in, so I'm gonna wait as long as I can before I speak.
I'll say something to that effect slightly. I appreciate your comment about this like individual versus community levels of altruism, because I feel as if a lot of times when we talk about altruistic behavior and changing the world, making changes, it's typically at the individual level when some systemic things cannot be addressed at an individual level. It has to be communal. It has to be organizational even, or but we use individual like obligations and individual, like you need to change XYZ, think about how you're living or how you're spending your money or how you're doing this, that, and the other, almost as a diversion, so that those who are truly responsible for some of these problems don't have to address them. So I find I'm appreciative of your comment, even if that's not exactly the direction you were headed. I do appreciate the comment of, when we talk about altruism, how much of our conversation should be centered on individual folks versus us as a community versus, holding larger agents to these standards. I also, to your last point about, I think it's an intriguing question, right? Of like, if things were randomized, what would people's perceptions of that be? I'm maybe naively optimistic that it wouldn't matter, right? That like, even if folks knew that they were like, their money was going to something that made a difference, that was doing good, I don't necessarily know that it would or I would hope that it wouldn't matter how tied they were to that thing, in terms of like emotionally or personally or, whatever. But it's a intriguing thing to think about and think through, and what the implications of that are for
Yeah.
how we package altruism and obligation.
One of the things they really didn't talk about in that podcast was about your obligation. A little bit they did, I should clarify, about family and your relationship, right? Compared to strangers. So like all strangers are, equivalent, right? But I don't know, I kind of I feel more affinity for my community. It's not just that you're a stranger. I mean, all of you here that are this like UCF Ethics Club, I feel more affinity to you than a stranger on the other side of the world. Um, just by nature of being in your virtual presence. And in a way, our affinity could grow to the point where you feel like family to me, these others in the community, right? And I'm Puerto Rican, for example, and Orlando is full of Puerto Rican cuisine and people and flags everywhere. Just all of Latin America and South America too, represented in the Orlando area. I feel most of these people are strangers to me, but some of them literally are probably my cousins that I don't know about. Right. And I have hundreds of cousins apparently. And my point that I'm bringing up is I think we're simplifying the notion of stranger and family too much in the podcast. I actually may have a genetic relationship to some strangers that I don't know about, is a real possibility. And they happen to also live in the same area that I care about. So helping education or art or poverty programs and stuff around here. So I think it's one of the very first episodes they talked about how you treat, you may save your sister over a distant cousin because you share more genes with that person. Um, it's just fascinating the thought that, do we actually have a predisposition to prefer our community? It's not just a random group of strangers. Like we actually might literally be closer to them genetically or ethnically or something like this. Is really interesting to me. America is really unique. I mean, we're so diverse as people, maybe compared to other countries as well. But yeah, Lakeland, thank you for, by your first, you were totally on the right train of thought for me, by the way, in that first point you made. So anyway, yeah, that's the end of my rant there. Any other thoughts?
Marcus, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, I actually want to comment on something Lakeland said about it, like a little anecdote that actually occurred to me at one point. It was a few years ago, and I recall doing a voluntary, what do you call that, donation to the Junior Achievement. And it was only because I had some type of familiarity with them long ago before then. And I was like, okay, I made some monetary donation. I don't really know where it goes or anything like that, but it just made me think, okay, that's a pretty good enough agency or organization. And then when I went to go purchase a new car, in the language and what they put in there, they do an actual deduction automatically as part of their price model, where they do a deduct or some type of donation as well on your behalf to Junior Achievement as well. And I was like, I actually don't want, in my head, I was going to say, I don't want to donate because I've already donated already. And it's like, oh, well, they're donating on my behalf. And they had to explain that to me. I was like, well, no, I don't want to include that into the price because that's anything adding to the price I don't want. And I was like, you know what? I had to stop myself for a second. So like, I just donated willingly to this organization. Now someone's basically taking my money and using a piece of that to wrap it into a donation on my behalf. And if I made a personal donation, my name's attached to it, and there's some recognition. They put it in a pamphlet or something like that, or some type of flyer. But when I do it on the behalf of the automotive company that I'm utilizing, my name's not necessarily attached to it, but they're doing it on my behalf still. Am I still in that altruistic behavior, acknowledging that my contribution is still helping this agency, whether I'm doing it or someone's doing it on my behalf? And I was like, it kind of stopped me and put me at a pause for a little bit. And I thought about that as you were discussing um, that obligated, like, do we want to know where our support is going, or do we need to know?
That's a really interesting point because I feel like oftentimes companies, when they do donate on your behalf, they can often use it as tax write-offs, and that doesn't always feel altruistic to me. So, yeah, I think I agree with you that I'd rather make that personal donation.
Yeah. It's interesting too because I think, I mean, one thing is, oh, sorry, I'm getting a little sick. I'm hearing, so the last speaker, excuse me, was talking a lot about autonomy as like the thing we should be aiming at when we're donating. But I feel like a lot of the conversation here is thinking about like, well, how, yeah, Marcus just explicitly, right? Like, I want to be the one who makes this decision. I don't want someone else making it for me, or like I don't want to be having this company make it for me and then like they're doing it for their own reasons. Like it's like my reasons being particularly important. And I wonder, I mean, certainly when I do think about what I do to give or help in this world, I am thinking for my reasons, but I wonder how important how much importance I should be giving to that, or am I somehow making the mistake that at least some of these speakers, some of the EA speakers, was thinking, the objection to the program and give to those communities you care about, or even to like a Jason sort of point here, like giving locally is like giving to family is like, well, your family, especially family you don't know and that sort of thing, are they really more important than all these other people somewhere else? And it feels like for some of us, and certainly I feel this, for me, it feels like somewhat like, oh, am I like being too self-interested in this act? Not merely because, okay, it doesn't count as altruism, but like, am I just wrong in general to be so focused on what my preference over the thing is, or should I be more focused on like some sort of good, whether that's autonomy or reducing malaria rates or whatever. So I think that's like an interesting that role of autonomy, because I'm not someone who usually gives a lot of weight to it, but it does come up both in the perspective of who we should give to, and then also when we're thinking about what ends we're trying to realize. I don't
I
know.
think a connection to that is something else I kind of want to tag in as well. Um, Sometimes, like those that are closest to us may benefit from some of the altruistic, behaviors that we've kind of, supported or donated to in the beginning. I even think about all the, Relay for Life, Heart Walk events that I've attended and participated and donated in, that are now very beneficial to some of my family members or, friends as we've aged and gotten older. They've been able to benefit from some of those very projects and work that I've done previously, many years ago. So while it may not be something that, and I kind of think about this in most altruistic ideals, is that while it may not affect, direct impact of family members or close contacts now, it's not to say that they're not, going to be plagued by something that might benefit them by this contribution later. I don't know if I worded that correctly. It didn't sound right, but um, essentially, like that's something that even what work I might do now for the improvement um, for all down the road might be something that friends or close family members could benefit from as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
think that's a great point. That benefit, the contribution now, you don't even realize how it may benefit you. It's fascinating. Like you donated to cancer research, let's say there's a cure in the future, I may be helping myself avoid cancer, right?
Mhm.
And in the case of some of the EA things like the malaria nets, let's say, and adding the quality years of life to people there, the more quality years of life they have from that donation, the more maybe they can contribute to the economy of their country and that culture, and therefore have a more developed country that begins trading with my own country and people, and this kind of shared realizing we are a global community actually that do influence
Mhm.
one another. So I guess there are many steps between the net and maybe an impact on me, but I do think you can argue that there can be an impact beyond that individual's life. I think so. It's fascinating to think you may be trying to help an individual, um, but we are individuals that live in a society that influence one another, and supporting other individuals can lead to these chances. So again, that I don't know. There's just no way to be purely altruistic is the point I keep landing on. There's no way to not benefit, to guarantee no benefit, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think even in the case we talk about organ donation, like even after you pass and can't even tell, you live with your life knowing you may help is just fascinating to me. How much it helps our psyche to know that we're helping, but also can be actual tangible positive benefits of what we think is still purely altruistic. Even in the case of existentialism and those existential crises of the extinction, we care about maybe biologically that our genes continue to pass on. It's like thousands of years from now, I would like my genes to exist. I don't ever think about that, right? But I think we operate in that way as humans, generally speaking. Is sort of fascinating, right? So even the existential altruistic arguments, I think, could still come back to this like selfish self-preservation and benefit need, perhaps. So yeah, I feel it's more and more convinced it's about um, this affinity for ourselves.
I think, I mean, it's definitely not totally like it's not 100% related, but I think this idea of like thinking about, yeah, what benefit we're having, right? And so in some sense, we can't accurately or effectively probably measure exactly like, okay, when I'm donating to this cancer research, is that going to benefit me? I also think that like draws attention to the idea of like when we think about what it is that we happen to care about, whether that's just ourselves in the end or something or not, right? That's going to just, it feels like to me that's going to shift the scope of like which decisions are going to feel legitimate for me. And so what I'm getting at here is like I don't do all the things. I actually just think I fail to live up to what I ought to do all the time. But broadly, like I think like look, someone not dying from malaria is good. Someone being able to have, deodorant and toothpaste and whatever is good. Like all these things are broadly good in some sense. And it feels to me like when I'm giving to that, like this is where I think this going back to the earlier, what is altruism thing? Yeah, there doesn't feel like there is much room there because it feels to me I'm a moral realist or an objectivist about values. I don't think these things are subjective. It feels like, well, if I actually believe it's good that people don't die from malaria, and then I get what I want, which is good, then it kind of does feel like, okay, sometimes, yeah, that's what I want, right? And so I fail to do it because I'm selfish or like all these perverse incentives or whatever, I don't know. But it does feel like that recognition is able to help me capture like, yeah, I might be given to something that it's not really not just for me. That in some ways it does come back to me because this is something I happen to value or happen to recognize is valuable. And so it's kind of hard to see like, okay, if I really do think promoting happiness is good, then isn't it good wherever it shows up? Or if I really do think reducing suffering is good, isn't that good wherever it's showing up? I don't know. In some sense, I'm kind of basically a utilitarian, or like even some Buddhist philosophy overlaps on this idea that like suffering is suffering wherever it shows, right? Um, that was a little off topic. I mean, so that the ramble just happened and I didn't get to a particular end point. I do have one thing I want to turn to in a few minutes, but yeah, other thoughts. So because you said a lot, Jason, I want to give you or others a chance
Yeah,
to jump in.
I'm glad you're showing your cards a little, Josh. I had this
I have
thought.
one more card I'm going to show later.
Okay, good. That so much of the EA focus on preventing suffering and like immense suffering and how little it takes to prevent a large amount of suffering. This is all fundamentally based on the notion that pain is to be avoided at all costs. It's like the supreme evil, let's say, like to avoid, or in that also
Correct.
implicitly that death as well is meant to be avoided at all costs. I would say most of us do share those same values of like wanting to avoid pain and death, but I'm sure there are philosophers that argue that we don't have to fear those things as much maybe as we do, and that there are other values we could value more. So you just mentioned like happiness for some reason, living life without regard to safety and recklessly. I know Camus in his myth of Sisyphus, he described a few people that live absurd lives, like realizing like uh, life in this universe is just absurd. And one of the people was a man that would live life really doing whatever he felt like. He would sleep with many women. He would roam around without not care about the well-being of others. So he felt no obligation to help others. And Camus was arguing not that that was a good way to live, but that is like a valid way to live. You can value that life is absurd and that there you kind of define your own uh, obligations per se to this universe that doesn't tell us what the meaning of it is, and we have all this power to decide what the meaning of living is. And for some it's like helping others, and even further like the thought of helping humanity improve. Whereas others, you could, I think, live your whole life completely self-interested and that still be a valid way to live life is sort of a fascinating, I think, counterpoint, right? So, and this, because so my point is the EA relies on this shared agreement that avoiding pain and suffering and death is the ultimate objective. But I think some could confidently argue that that's not maybe a universal desire or wish, which is sort of fascinating. So I guess, yeah, you said you're a moral objectivist. Maybe I'm arguing that there is a valid case for the subjective part.
I actually want to jump in here because, well, first of all, I think what you said could be consistent with the moral objectives and thing. I think you are identifying though that thinking about what things are that we happen to value or care about is going to be relevant here, right? If all you care about is reducing suffering, then the options that look plausible to you, even if we agree on what metric, how we should aim at them, right? So just trying to maximize the outcome or something is going to look very different than if you agree, like Perlman says, right? Optimizing the outcome is good, but so is having a caring relationship with somebody or participating in solidarity. Because if you have these extra values that also are relevant, they can also shift like which of our available options are important. That is going to lead you to see different options as worth pursuing. And I think, and there's more to say on that. I also want to just address earlier this idea that like, well, you brought up as giving randomly, but like essentially like, so long as we're giving is an idea people sometimes have, like it's good to give, and so it doesn't really matter where. But I think especially for so people like me, that's really hard because right, like even autonomy, that doesn't feel to me good, all things considered. I don't want Hitler to realize the things Hitler wants to realize. I don't want blah blah. And so one is like certain values, sometimes there are things I don't want, and I think it would be wrong to promote them. But a second problem I think is distinct is like sometimes there's things in tension. And so actually, interesting enough, EA 2.0 has this like ambivalence towards getting involved in politics because I think we become more partisan, we start to fight each other, and we waste our money, right? So if I'm thinking what I care about is like, I want to make X more efficient, and you think X is a bad thing to exist, if we pour money into that, we're just going to cancel each other out. And that feels to me like, of course, we shouldn't do that then. That does seem like a waste. But yeah, I guess there's two things up in there. I'm realizing the discussion is great because we have to say, but so either of those things we go thinking about what values are, I mean, or a third thing that you have in mind would be worth discussing. But yeah, did I babble or ramble a little?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the random thing again, because I think it's been implied but not said out loud that we also want to avoid negative outcomes. We don't want vicious acts done. So there's an assumption that all nonprofits do good. That maybe is not true, right? and that when you are, so one of the things is like giving the homeless cash over giving them a meal. Some people are like, I'd rather give a meal or socks or a material, when really maybe that person all they wants is cash. It's like, oh, I'm not going to give cash because they can spend it on drugs and alcohol. And that's because you're valuing, those are not valuable activities, right, for the use of your charity, in your opinion. But yeah, sort of fascinating to the sense of control is like so important to us apparently, as people, about the outputs of our actions. And I think it's not black or white. Like, I think the give well folks, it's like those people are like, when I use this money, I can build XYZ thing and improve my life. So I do think it's okay to screen, and wonder, and to ask, what will you do with these funds? I'm not going to tell you what to do with it, but I hope you will do good with it, is the point, right? That helps with the autonomy, because right, the drinking and the doing drugs isn't helping with the autonomy. It's like, we want you to overcome your obstacles, is really the point, right? So maybe you could randomly give to vetted organizations, and I think that's literally the whole point of effective altruism, right? These organizations have been like meticulously studied, and their metrics of success proven in a way over time, or much evidence given that donating to these is assuredly a good thing, because there is a lot of waste from nonprofits. It's fascinating.
I think that is one of the distinctions between EA 1.0. So effective altruism 1.0 was really focused on these metrics and things like that, versus 2.0, there was a shift towards like it was there, but like this idea that probabilistically things can make sense, like, right, a 10% chance of having 1,000% increase in something could, I'm not good at math, there's some equation, right, the relevance of, right, like 100% chance of getting 1 unit is the same as a 1% chance of getting 100 units. And so, but for some of us, that seems like a mistake. And so EA 1.0 was really metric focused in that way. And I think that's a problem some folks have with the, like the far future. Certainly Lazar had it. I want to, one, because we might start a bit of a discussion here, but to flag that the next sessions might be relevant here. So Lakeland brought up a point much earlier about the individual versus the social, or like bigger picture by approaching some of these problems, right? Like, there is nothing almost any of us could do to like meaningfully slow climate change, right? Maybe Elon Musk or something could do something, but like broadly, none of us can. And so sometimes there's a concern that effective altruism is too focused, right, on the individual. And this is because they are concerned with like, okay, what are other people doing? So the basic principles are, you want to do things that are neglected because your impact is going to be bigger. So considering marginal return. You want to do things that are important. So like, if you succeed, how important is, how good is this going to be for the world? And you want to do things that are tractable. That is like, am I likely to succeed in this thing? Because that's like a 3-part formula that would like give you an output for how important things are. But that does often lead us away from like these bigger social movement type stuff, right? Like, it's hard to make an argument for neglectedness to get involved with the social movement just as it's starting to come to power and become, at the point of success. And so this is a thing that's relevant. I also want to notice that the individual focus, and that's where I was connecting, might be a problem, right? So next time we'll talk about democracy and philanthropy, and how there's like arguments that philanthropy, so individual giving, can be a problem for democracies in various ways. We don't spoil it. Then the session on April 2nd, so like our last one of the term, is going to talk about international justice and foreign aid. And so there's a little bit more about, do we have an obligation to give because we've committed wrongs in the past versus just to do good? But there's also, again, these questions of like systemic or structural issues. Often it's hard to see how an individual can make a meaningful difference there. And so there might be reasons that we want to think, well, one of the things is getting wrong. Maybe we all agree we want to realize, though of course we don't, some end, promote autonomy or realize happiness. Even still, there might be a problem with the focus on individual versus social stuff too. So now I'm gonna hands off for the next 7 minutes, I swear.
I want to say Jason made me think of something about the control factor, and it's like curating the give. with even just thinking about giving to the unhoused population. I've seen many videos where someone pulls up a truck or some sort and they hand out certain supplies that they think the unhoused population might need or benefit from. And they also give them like some type of monetary that they can choose what they do with that remaining amount. So it's kind of like the element of support. But I think so much of what we do in our passerby altruism, um, in terms of like, donating, we always typically speaking, there's an element of control where we want to control where or how those dollars are used to say that, okay, if I'm going to do this possibly again in the future, I want to know that this money is going to be used wisely, or that whoever I'm giving to, whether it be an individual or group organization, I can track and see how that money was used. And I might give some suggestion on how to use it or where to put the most effort in providing to the community. So I think that element of control is also maybe what affects our future altruism.
Or as we're having these discussions, because a lot of it, and I came in late, so I might have missed a good chunk of conversation, but it seems like a lot of our discussion in terms of altruism is tied to money, which I think is certainly a large part of it. But I wonder the implications of these discussions and some of the things that we've been positing when it comes to altruistically giving your time. Because time and how the outputs of your time are harder to track. So yeah, for money, you can say, where's my money going? And you can see that. What does that mean for time, right? When you're giving your time, how do you track that? How do you control that? Because I'm kind of referencing the blurb from this session, right? Where it says people devote large portions of their time, energy, and expertise. How do you track expertise in terms of output? And if you're giving expertise altruistically, what does control or those three kind of criteria that you were talking about, Josh, how does that manifest when we step back from only considering, not only, but like from primarily considering money as the altruism, and when we think of altruism through different mediums and different channels? So just something I was thinking about when we were talking, and I think it kind of becomes a little bit more relevant in some of the future discussions that we'll have, but just something to kind of highlight. I don't know.
Yeah. I'll say, oh, yeah, jump in.
I was just gonna say, when we talk about effort, a good thing to think about would be like what we develop as a society. I would say like with AI and all that in EA2, we have to make an effort for these agents to be moral. And before we really put forth something that's advanced, we have to make sure that it is altruistic in nature. So, yeah, I think like when we make technological advancements, we have to think, will our advancements do good or will it be used negatively, and how we can avoid that?
I like that a lot. And I think that that's kind of where our obligation lies. So I think the question of like, are we obligated to give more or less? Are we obligated to, I think the real question is, are we obligated to critically evaluate our altruism and critically evaluate? Because at the end of the day, I don't really think it matters how much. I think that's the wrong question, because to each give to their capacity, right? It's the whole story of like, you give 2 pennies, but if that's all you have to give, that's a lot for you, right? And so I think the question of how like should we be telling folks how much or how little to give is maybe the wrong question to ask, versus do we have an obligation to really kind of critically think through some of this in terms of like what we're doing and are we doing it just to feel good that we're doing something, or and do the places that we're giving our altruism?
I think that goes back to the society versus individual point, right? We have societal goals actually of eradicating hunger in the United States, let's say. I hope that's a societal goal, first of all. And this idea, like each of us here can donate a different thing, time or money, or expertise to that cause. But there's this concept, I guess, that with enough resources, a problem could be solved, is the belief, right? In the case of AI, risk research, with enough time and expertise, we can solve the problem. Like you have to believe the problem is tractable. So for tractable problems, that means that there's actually a point where like enough resources solves the problem. And I guess that's my point, that we can hope this problem is solved through communal effort, and that it's the obligation isn't on the individual, but at least on the community of individuals, like to track and make progress towards the goal. I think is so much more important because so many people have different capabilities of giving, for example. And yeah, I think that's why there's maybe frustration about how much billionaires and millionaires do not get taxed compared to the 98%, right? Is the idea that we have community goals and this equity of effort, and is actually maybe more of the obligation that are you putting in your fair share towards this communal goal, maybe is more important. But you mentioned too, like don't time and money. The saying goes like time is money, right? And therefore the other
I was
way
just
around.
thinking time is money too. Yeah.
Money is time. Therefore, and that equality, meaning that when you give money, you're giving people more time to do something, but you could instead be the one with exerting the effort via spending the time and the expertise. Some of these problems require you to go through grad school and do research and learn the science, and you have to spend so much time and money to do this, but the result might be different. Instead, you could pay someone else to do that for you. So you're kind of trading your time, your personal time, for someone else's. Sort of interesting, right? I think money becomes time and vice versa.
I think I'm gonna say two things before we close. One is I just the 80,000 hours, which Jason mentioned earlier. So many in the EA community do think we really should think about what we're doing, not just giving money, but also what sort of careers should we get involved in? Should we do a PhD in AI security or something? Like, so there is the way in which some folks think that's really serious. That's one thing. Distinct point. I think it also, depending on the scope, again, I keep just repeating the same things. The scope of what we think is important or what goods are at stake here, whether it's just outcomes or other things. There's certain ways in which, like, you know, if you're going to behave in altruistic ways, it's not something that you can buy your way out of, right? The thought is that you actually do have to participate and take some interaction. Or in political behaviors, often we think like it's not enough, or maybe it's even objectionable to try and use your money instead of your time in certain situations. And so that might be another thing that's relevant, right? If I'm supposed to relate to you in a certain way, it might be inappropriate to say, okay, I'm not going to love my children. I'm going to pay Jason to love my children, right? Isn't that just as good? Well, we think no, and so certain values are like that. They can't be commodified in that way. So that's another thing we might think through. With that, this session is over, so I'm going to let folks leave if they'd like. I can show a little bit. I do want to encourage y'all to come to the next sessions. Next one, we're going to go looking at the philanthropy and giving as it relates to democracy, talk about some possible costs there, and then we'll look at some foreign aid, international justice stuff. But thank you everybody for coming, and I hope to see y'all again.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.